All right. Well, good morning. We'll whatever you want to do. If you feel better moving forward, I'm guessing a couple of people will.
Don't do like the Methodists and sit back.
Yeah. Yeah. You never know from week to week how things will play out, but there'll be some people watching in from home. Yeah. Yeah. So they are recording these things, so there are people who watch from home. So this is we'll wait. That's good. This is my last week in my series. I think Pastor Michael will be back next week. So I'll say this to you and to anybody at home. I want to thank people for their comments and feedback. People have been very, very gracious, and it's been a joy to discuss things with you, or I guess many times lecture to you, especially when I was on Zoom. There wasn't opportunity for discussion, but it's been really quite encouraging to me, and like I said, a joy to go over some of this. Last week, the main theme with world Christianity, our main point that I wanted to make was how much Christianity in the last century, and especially half century, has grown in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and what that means, that the center of gravity of Christianity is, as some say, shifted from north to south, or northwest to southeast, if you will, or south and east in the world. And with that center of gravity having shifted, the world is a different place. And today I want to talk about some of the implications of that shift. There are a lot of implications. I won't get to all of them. In fact, I don't know all of them. We're still figuring out exactly what this means, that there are so many Christians in Africa by comparison to Christians in the United States or Europe, and also Asia and Latin America. But let me point out a few things. Last week I gave you the example of William Wade Harris, who was a evangelist who managed to spread Christianity through West Africa in a rather remarkable sort of way. And I said that he was the rule, not the exception. And so I want to expand on that a little bit and ask, well, what implications are in terms of what does that tell us? What does that tell us about how cross-cultural interaction works in the church today and in Christianity? And one point I think that we see with William Wade Harris is that we need to recognize more of the contributions of non-Western Christians to the life of the church. And not only individuals, but what they contribute and how they contribute. And how a lot of them, people who are not famous, what I would just call ordinary Christians, ordinary people around the world have contributed and continue to contribute to the Christian faith today. And to recognize that, in our conception of history, well, not only conception of history, but I think our default mode is that we go right to people like us. Immediately is what comes to mind. We think of Westerners, we think of Americans, we think of Europeans maybe, Protestants, and we need to kind of train our minds to think of other sorts of people. So even in our history, for instance, when we talk about missionaries, we have some missionaries that are somewhat famous. Most Christians of a certain age have heard of David Livingston and remember the big phrase that people used to talk. I don't think my students of that age hear of this or hear of him, but When I was growing up, that phrase, Dr. Livingston, I presume, people knew the phrase, even if they didn't know exactly where it came from. And Livingston was a celebrity. He was a celebrity for his travels in Africa. He'd arrived in Africa in 1841 and was in South Africa actually for about a decade. And then he began exploring. And this is where he got the fame. He began exploring inland in Africa, and he wrote about it. He returned to England, or Great Britain. He was actually Scottish himself, but he returned to England in 1857 to a hero's welcome. He'd gained so much fame, and then returned to Africa in 1858 and went inland, and people just didn't hear about him for years, for like 6 years, and wondered where David Livingston was, and that's when the explorer Henry Stanley came upon him, and I guess didn't know what else to say when he met him and said, Dr. Livingston, I presume. But the point is that Livingston then came back to England and was incredibly famous and generated a great deal of interest in Africa and also the missionary movement. And he's probably about the only missionary who makes it into history textbooks. And then oftentimes he's misinterpreted in my way of thinking. But more than any single person, he got England excited about missionary work, and he's so famous that he's buried in Westminster Abbey. If you go there at some time, a little place to look. But here's the question. What impact did he have? He had a huge impact in England and even in the United States. What impact did he have, excuse me, got a little excited there. What impact did he have in Africa? And the reality is that he really didn't establish any church, any schools, any long-term ministry. Maybe over his lifetime, he was instrumental in helping 6 people become Christian. His impact was more on the West, and that's where his celebrity comes from. Then in terms, it was important for exploring areas, but not much that we would consider in terms of the work of the church in Africa. However, if we go to somebody like this, Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, we can see much more impact on Africa. He's a different part of Africa, West Africa. I call Crowther like the Jackie Robinson of the Anglican episcopacy. He got to become bishop, and he was African, the first African bishop in the Church of England. He had been enslaved as a boy around 1800 and was taken off and then was freed and sent back to Sierra Leone, which was a colony set up by the British for people who had been freed. And he became a Christian and was very, very bright and worked his way up through the Anglican system and was seen to have gifts. And they actually took him back to England, and he got a higher education in England, came back to minister to Africa. And in working with Anglican missionary officials, they eventually not only made him a pastor, but made him a bishop, and then did this, gave him authority over a string of churches along the Niger River with African pastors that he had authority over. And so it was, and this actually developed into a missionary theory that really what missionaries should be doing is working themselves out of a job and handing over the authority of the church to local leaders. And Samuel Ajayi Crowther was the main point person in that, and he, for then 30 or 40 years, oversaw a number of churches along the Niger River and African pastors, and that was part of the growth of Christianity in that area. So, he laid a foundation, and like I said, in some ways, I think, hundreds and hundreds of people, joined the Christian faith in that process. Or let's go to somebody who was a celebrity in America, Adaniram Judson. More of a celebrity in the 19th century than today. But in the 19th century, he really truly was a celebrity among many people, among many Protestants. How famous? 14 biographies. 14 different biographies were written of him. Poems, songs, churches, a denominational press. Several colleges were named after him. You can even go up to Cleveland and Judson at University Circle. Actually, I'm cheating a little bit on that. I think technically Judson at University Circle is named after his son, but his son wouldn't have been famous without him. His son was a minister also whose doors opened up because of Adaniram Judson. Even a ship, the SS Adaniram Judson, a cargo ship during World War II, was named after him, and I had a student do a web search, and we found 122 different people named Adaniram Judson. Some people named their kids after him, including a man named Adaniram Judson Gordon, who founded Gordon College, if you've ever heard of that. So Adaniram Judson was very much a famous person. Part of the reason that he was famous was because while he was in Burma, a movement of Christianity took off there that got a lot of attention. Now, Judson himself and his wife were significant. He and his wife were the first American Baptist missionary overseas. He translated the Bible into Burmese, which is still used in Burma today, his translation. He worked in Burma for almost 40 years. And like I said, while he was there, Christianity took off. But he himself may have been directly responsible for about, I don't know, maybe 24 people coming to Christ. But the Christianity that took off grew very quickly to like 20,000 people. Well, you know, how did all those people become Christians? Well, a man by the name of Crowther, who was a leader of what we call the Karen people, and he was a primary evangelist, and during a very short time, 10 years, was responsible for more than 1,000 people becoming Christian and churches being planted, and then a bunch of other Karen evangelists along with him following in his wake built this movement. I'm guessing there aren't many Americans who have heard of Crowther. Except for the Wallaces, for various reasons. If you work with the Karen people, maybe you would have heard. There is a seminary in Burma named after him. There was a biography, a missionary printed a biography, made a biography of him in the 19th century. It's the only biography I have seen yet of a non-Westerner in the 19th century, written by a Westerner. But he is maybe more responsible for, or we have to give him a great deal of credit for spearheading a lot of this movement of Christianity in Burma. One last famous person, in certain places, Lottie Moon is very, very famous. Most every Southern Baptist has heard of Lottie Moon. She was a Southern Baptist missionary. She worked in China, and while she was in China, in her area, again, a movement of Christianity took off. And I don't know if you're seeing a pattern here, but movement takes off, and then we make the missionary famous. And Lottie Moon is so famous that every year the Southern Baptists hold their major missions offering at Christmas, and they named it after her, the Lottie Moon Christmas Offering. And to generate support for that, they made Lottie Moon into a Southern Baptist celebrity. Outside of that denomination, she's not as famous. But every year, that offering provides half of the total of the mission board monies that the Southern Baptist Church receives. And you can find Lottie Moon note cards and biographies and pamphlets, 3 plays, a movie, 2 children biographies, official portraits, and of course, everybody's favorite, the Lottie Moon cookbook. I don't know if there's Chinese food in the Lottie Moon cookbook or not. I'm afraid I haven't used it. Also, I had a dog named after her by mistake. That's another story. that maybe I can tell you sometime if for some strange reason you're interested. But the main reason that Lottie Moon was famous was because, I mean, she was in China for quite a while, and this movement of Christianity took off while she was there, and she was connected to it. But the primary evangelist was a man by the name of Li Shaoting. Now, Li Shaoting, so little known then and now that I can't even find a picture of him. And so this is a group of Chinese people from the 1920s in the Shandong Peninsula where he worked, and he was a little bit before that. But by the time Lottie Moon died in 1912, he was responsible for bringing more than 1,000 people to Christ and setting up churches all over the place. But you know, it was like he was on the ground building the churches, and she was assisting, but she's the one that gets the cookbook. So this is, I think we need to do some work at kind of revising or recalibrating the ledger here and recognize that there are non-Western Christians who have been very, very important in a lot of this process. But also I want to point this out, what this tells us about Li Shaoting and Kota Bu and Samuel Ajayi Crowther and William Wade Harris and the missionaries they're connected to, and that's this, because this tells us something. Missionaries are lousy evangelists. They just have not been that good at bringing a lot of people into the church. Local evangelists, however, have been very, very good. And there's a reason for this, and it makes sense once we unpack it. Now, I do want to mention that there's a role for missionaries. Kota Bu became a Christian largely because of Adaniram Judson, and Li Shaoting became a Christian largely because of Lottie Moon. And there are other sort of things that missionaries do in terms of, and we're going to talk about more of that in just a minute, in terms of schools and a host of other things. But here's the point why this is, and that is local people have expertise that missionaries don't have. And one of them is language. If you think about it, who's the expert in the local language, the vernacular language? Now, a missionary can become an expert in, you know, you can learn Mandarin Chinese or whatever particular form of Chinese is spoken on the ground, or learn the Igbo language in Nigeria, or Zulu or Kikuyu or something like that. But think about this. How long would it take you to learn a language? How long did it take to learn Kikuyu? Then how long would it take to master the patterns of speech and be able to master at a level where you can talk about, you know, local sort of stories and oral histories, but then also talk about theological concepts? How long would it take for you to be able to explain the atonement in another language? And then how long would it take for you to figure out not only the language, but to use that language to sort of identify how people thought in terms of their day-to-day lives, and so that what you talked about would connect with whatever conflicts and spiritual issues and personal sort of issues are going on with people. And then how long would it take to effectively connect that to the gospel? And of course the answer is years and years and years. And then who knows how long you or I would be good at it. And yet local people know the language, and they know the modes of communication automatically. I mean, you become an expert at your own language really when you're a child, and you get better just automatically. And that matters today in a number of ways. I'll tell you a little personal story. About every 2 years, I take a group of Malone students to Kenya. I have friends. There we go. I have friends here, Isaac and Esther Munji, in the middle. They are African. They are Kikuyu. I've known them for about 35 years. And they run this fantastic ministry, really impressive ministry. When I'm with Isaac, I feel like just a really puny Christian. Not because I feel belittled. I just feel like I have so far to grow. But they work in this town in Kenya, which is really kind of a truck stop. It's on an intersection of main highways in the country. And it has maybe 90% HIV rates and a lot of prostitution because truckers stop. And, you know, truck stops in the United States and elsewhere are oftentimes not real socially healthy places. Well, Isaac and Esther feed kids like every day. And they take in homeless boys running the streets and give them a home. And they take in girls and they provide a safe house for girls who sometimes are threatened to be sexually abused. And they work with women who are trying to get out of prostitution. And they end up setting up counseling services for these people. And because Kenya's a poor country, but these are the poorest of the poor. And they are people who have ended up in this little town of a truck stop of a town because, I don't know, their husbands have left them or, you know, whatever tragedies have befallen their families, and they're bumped out of their local communities. And so my first time that I took a group of Malone students over to Kenya, and this ministry he's only had it running for a little over 10 years, but we were walking down the streets of this town, the dirt road, and Isaac is telling me about his ministry. He's telling me about this town, Maimahiu, and the people, and I'm talking to him, and I'm thinking about, you know, all the sort of political and economic and cultural changes that are going on, and why these people are this way, and he's telling me about this, and all of a sudden we look up ahead, and there's a girl standing in the road, about 4 or 5 years old, and Isaac was just saying, you know, like this girl here, why is she here? You know, where is her mother? And then he stopped. And then he went into another mode suddenly. And he went up to the girl, and he very gently knelt down, and he started talking to her in Kikuyu. And then she started talking back to him, and, you know, they got up, and he said, follow us. We're going to her home. Which at that point, I was feeling like the disciples in John 9. And you know the story, they're walking down the road with Jesus and they see a man born blind, and the disciples are asking a theological question. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And I'm like the professor thinking about, the socioeconomic, political. Isaac is like, here's a girl in need. So he was being Jesus at that point. And so we follow this girl around to her home, and she has an older sister who was about 6, who was babysitting her and 3 other younger kids, and her mom was nowhere to be seen. And they talked about her mom goes out, and I don't know exactly what the story was, but there were a lot of families like that. And Isaac, you know, talked to those girls and invited them to come to the church for food, but also he now knew where they lived, and he would send people from his church. They were going to come visit that house and try to meet the mother. Now, here's one little point. If I were there as a missionary, you know, I can't, the kids go off to school and learn English and Swahili, but they know Kikuyu from the start. Being able to speak Kikuyu just to a 4-year-old girl on the street, terribly important in terms of ministry. Also, the fact that he himself is Kikuyu, she was much more willing to talk to him than she probably would have been to me, some strange, tall, gangly white guy. And so there are these, just on the virtue of the culture they come from, there are ways that local people have expertise that missionaries cannot fully model, or will take them a long, long time to fully model. And that relates then to the culture also. So here's an example of. I'll get to this woman here in just a minute, but I'm gonna throw this quiz out to you. This is not a quiz. This is just a really strange question. So, when missionaries went and were translating the Bible into local language, this related translation, which I talked about several weeks ago, right? It takes a long time to translate the entire Bible. And so you have to make decisions. What books are you going to translate first? And usually you pick a gospel. And translate a gospel first, get that into the hands of people. Maybe Mark. Translate the book of Mark into. Here's then the question. Okay, you've translated a gospel into the hands of the people. What's the next book? Where do you go second? It's an interesting question, and I've got an idea. Anybody want to nominate a book? Just off the top of your head? Acts. Acts is a great choice. Any others? What? What? Genesis. I've often thought of Genesis. I've wondered about the Psalms. So missionaries are working with Samuel Ajayi Crowther. Remember him, the Jackie Robinson of the Anglican Episcopacy? And they're working on translating the Bible into these languages in this group. I think it was the Yoruba in the Niger area. And Crowther says, the second book we need to translate, Leviticus. Leviticus? Have you read Leviticus lately? Try not to. But here's the thing, and I don't fully understand this, but Crowther understood something about how these African peoples understood religious faith. And what he knew was that issues of cleanliness and were tied to issues of holiness and issues of approaching God. And, Leviticus has all these rules, right, about cleanliness and also about the altar and so forth. And in their way of thinking for these African peoples, this made sense to them. And I think then also what Crowther understood then, the connection between that and then what Christ is doing was very important also. I don't know exactly how or why, but I do know this. A lot of African peoples read the Old Testament and they're like, these ancient Jews, they're like us. There's places of connection. You and I would never think of that. And in fact, the missionaries didn't. But here you have somebody who grew up African and he got this theological education and he understood. No, this is what the next book is. See, and so that's also how an advantage of culture works. When I first took my students to Kenya to work with Isaac and Esther, one of the things that he'd have us do was we'd go visit people in their houses. And oftentimes it was like this, a woman with 5 kids, 7 kids, 9 kids living in a little shack or a little one-room apartment. As one of my students said, my bedroom is bigger than her house, And when we got there and Isaac said, well, we're going to go meet these people and pray for them, my thought was, that's nice. And I didn't realize how really very, very important this was. Now, on 2 levels. Number one, the first thing I did recognize is when we went to their house, and I'm there, we split up, and we had groups of 3 or 4 of us. We go to their house, and we meet a woman like this, and she talks about her life, and then invariably, there are people in Isaac's church, and they'd say, God is so good to me, and he's taking care of me, even though they're facing really, really rough things. And then we'd have a time of prayer, and Isaac would point to one of our Malone students to say, you're going to pray. And they'd pray for them. And the first time we did this, one of my students starts crying. And I'm like, okay, this is important. So it has, number one, I saw this at first. It has an impact on my students. But the second thing, and it took me a couple of trips to fully appreciate and realize this, that praying was very, very important for these Kenyan people too. Extremely important. because these are people who feel like nobody cares about them. They're bumped out of their communities and their families in Kenya. They're the poorest of the poor, and nobody cares about them, and they themselves feel worthless. And so to have other people just come and listen to them, to hear about their lives and pray with them, was incredibly encouraging to them, far more, and that's the service. We call them service learning trips, and you can imagine what our students are learning a lot. But the service, you know, Americans, when we think of service on a trip like this, let's go build something. Let's paint a room or build a play. Okay, this is service, and in many ways, very, very powerful kind of service. But you see, even though I lived in Kenya for 6 years, did not fully grasp that. But Isaac, who is Kikuyu himself and also came from a pretty rough, very poor background, knew and understood those things. So are there things that non-Westerners understand, expertise in their culture, that we don't have because we're not from that culture? So this has implications for how we do cross-cultural sort of things. That actually what we're looking at is there's a partnership, and you know, Westerners and non-Westerners are both bringing expertise in different kinds of things together in partnership. We have resources that can be very helpful. Isaac loves to have groups come because actually there's support we bring. Like I said, even just, even white people come and pray with these people is significant to them in various ways, but also, there's financial support and other ways that we can help them also. So that's another implication of this growth of world Christianity, that we need to recognize that, that the partnership is very, very important, coming alongside one another. What does each group have to bring to the table? And everybody does have something to bring to the table. All right. A bit different direction, another implication of world Christianity. And I want to go back to what I talked about last week, how the scholarship for many years has been, the missionary movement has been one of cultural imperialism, that you're compelling conversions and you're westernizing and so forth. And implied in that way of thinking among these scholars was that, of course, then it hinders the growth of democracy and freedom. And of course, part of that implication is that, how do nations become democratic? Well, it's only when they get more modern, and oftentimes that means secular ways of thinking and economic development and urbanization. If you can get them to look like Denmark, then they'll be good democracies. However, in that scholarship reigned for quite some time, and still is, I think, reigning among many scholars today. And along comes this guy, a guy by the name of Bob Woodbury. And Bob Woodbury is a sociologist. He himself was a missionary kid. His father had been a missionary in Pakistan, and then his father actually went off to Fuller Theological Seminary and taught there. Bob Woodbury grew up and then went off and got a PhD in sociology and was interested in the missionary movement. Did a lot of research and published an article in the American Political Science Review called The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy. Now, his argument is this, and I wrote this out, but that's because there's a lot of dimensions to it. It says areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence are on the average more economically developed today, with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental associations. And missionaries heavily influenced the rise and spread of stable democracies around the world. Now, when you realize that existing scholars are like, oh, missionaries here and there are messing things up, imperialists, so forth. Woodbury comes along, yeah, here are the missionaries, they're creating democracies. there's like, what, and what Bob Woodbury did with, you have to understand a few things about this. First of all, the American Political Science Review is the top academic journal in political science. You can't get published unless you can convince others that your work is top-notch. And the APSR is also a journal that is not inclined to believe Bob Woodbury's thesis. Because, they've been shaped by the old scholarship. And in fact, they were skeptical enough when he produced his work, which was 31 pages of very complicated sociological data. They said, we want to see more before we accept this. It's interesting. He responded with 192 additional pages of material. He'd been on this and by the way, the material is stuff like this. Model 1 shows the Protestant mission coefficients in the full sample and blah, 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 that sort of thing. And I do know that one of the significant things about the article is that he included two-stage least squares instrumental variable analysis. And I have no idea what that is. It's in there. It matters to sociologists and political scientists who are into high-level quantitative, qualitative analysis. But in other words, Bob Woodbury was doing top-notch scholarship in this area. They said, this is good, we are convinced. They published it, and it's won 4 academic awards since then. But apart from this, there's some things I can understand about this. and I'll tell you this, that basically missionaries help promote, well, all this is his thesis. It helps economic development, it helps infant mortality, lower corruption, and essentially democracy. And the question is why? And there are several aspects to this. But first of all, since the 1790s, one thing that missionaries have been doing is training non-Westerners to be preachers and teachers, right? This is the other thing, when you go into it and you're starting the small church in China or Africa or someplace else, you're going to take some of your converts and you're going to make them preachers, and some of the converts, the men, and sometimes the women, you're going to make them teachers. And the idea is, the missionaries aren't thinking, we want to build democracy. They were thinking, we want to build the church. And we need church leaders, and we need, people to educate. But stop and think about what this meant then. Everywhere missionaries went, they were building primary schools and secondary schools, and then they started building high schools and colleges. Women got involved, like Sarah Boardman, the missionary is talking about, training kids, educating children, and girls were educated. And there were unintended consequences to this. So think of it this way. Under colonialism, the British, the French, or wherever are there. And then, in the late 50s and early 60s, in many places like Africa, suddenly the British and the French leave. Okay, it's an independent country now. Who are the new leaders? Well, to be a new leader of a country, you need to be trained in, really, it's going to be helpful if you have a modern Western education in some way. Right? Traditional cultures had education, but it was informal, and it was not in what we would today call schools in many places around the world. Like Africa, you'd be training kids into the ways of your people and how you're supposed to live, and how, the kids would go out with the parents to work in the farms and grow things, and you'd also, through rites of passage, learn about being a warrior or so forth. China had schools for the elite. India had schools for the elite, but the rest of it was informal training, right? But if you're going to run a modern bureaucratic system, essentially you're going to need an education that at least introduces you to modern ways of doing things. And so the result is, the leaders that emerged went to places like, in Kenya, Alliance High School, which was founded by Anglican missionaries. And well before independence, what was happening was, of course, the Anglicans are training leaders to be church leaders. They're wanting, we're going to take these people in, and they're going to be preachers and and teachers in our Anglican schools and so forth. But the Africans, some of them are going there for that reason, but others are like going there for like, oh, this is the route into this world. So by 1947, Alliance High School in Kenya on their, what today that we might call O-level tests or so forth, the tests that they were getting, they were, their test scores equaled the best schools in Great Britain. I mean, those missionaries and the highly motivated Africans were learning very, very well. The result is, through the 40s and 50s, Alliance High School is turning out these high school grads, some of whom went off to university in Great Britain. When independence comes, well, Jomo Kenyatta, first president, educated in missionary schools, went to Alliance High School, then went off to university in Kenya. 75% of his cabinet came from Alliance High School. And part of the reason is there aren't any other schools around. I mean, there were other schools, but let me put it this way. Missionaries were the only ones who were building schools. In fact, colonial officials really were not interested in building schools, except for just on the most basic level to train Africans to be clerks, you know, and do the but it was just this utilitarian, kind of like vocational education, if you will, but not the higher level training in humanities and democracy and that sort of thing. And so if you look all around, what you'll find is the first leaders of Africa, Kwame Nkrumah, first president of Ghana, missionary schools. Julius Nyerere, Tanzania, Catholic, went to a Catholic school. Leopold Senghor in Senegal, Catholic, went to a Catholic high school. Kenneth Kaunda, first president of Zambia, missionary schools. In other places, Sun Yat-sen, very important Chinese leader, trained in missionary schools. Gandhi even went to a missionary college, a college formed by missionaries. Aung San Suu Kyi, who is today very much involved in really kind of crazy politics in Myanmar, went to a missionary school. Desmond Tutu recently passed away, came up through Anglican missionary schools. Nelson Mandela went to Methodist missionary schools. So you have leaders who come out of this. But it's more than just leaders, because you need more than leaders in a democracy. You need a body of people. And so the other thing is that what happens is a lot of these missionary schools are the foundation for the educational system throughout the entire country in many of these places. And here's where things are a little bit different. If you think of a place like China, had writing and education for thousands and thousands of years. But it was always for a small class of elites. Missionaries are coming in and they're training ordinary people. They're not necessarily elites, not going to go through, they're not going to become a Chinese magistrate in a province or a town. They're just going to go out. They're also educating girls. Whoa, what happens when you educate girls? Do you remember when I was talking about the Puritans? Did I mention Anne Hutchison? Railing against the establishment, saying, I've got a different idea about how things, there's this tradition. Well, I'll get to girls and education in just a minute. But I just want to mention this about education, that essentially in China and India, where you had formal education, missionaries are educating common, ordinary people, which is a very important foundation for a whole host of other things. Now, like I said, they weren't doing it because they're trying to convert people to democracy. They're just thinking, we need church people. But it has other consequences that they did not see and did not recognize. Other things that missionaries did. You have boycotts and mass petitions and pledges arising in India in the 1820s. That doesn't happen in France till the 1840s. What? Why? Because missionaries who had been in India since the 1790s had a conflict with the British East India Company. And what do you do in a democracy? Or better yet, what if you do if you're a Protestant dissenter? We've got it built into us, to kind of rail against the elites and the authorities. You do things like, you boycott, or you petition the British East India Company, or you have these petitions. And then what happened is that Indian Christians would follow the example of the missionaries, and then non-Christian Indians would follow their example on these sorts of things. In France, it took a while for these kinds of democratic practices, if you will, to emerge. Advocacy. I don't know if you've ever heard of King Leopold's company in Belgium. King Leopold, the King of Belgium, his company in the Congo, really, really bad abuses trying to extract rubber. Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness, it was dark there. But there was reforms against the abuses of that British colony started with the missionaries advocating for Africans who were being killed and sometimes maimed, their hands cut off and so forth, because they're out there saying, wait, what is going on? You can't have this sort of thing going on. Missionary printing, books, newspapers, and literacy. Many newspapers around the world were started by, there are newspapers in many countries around the world that have been in existence for 150 years and are started by missionaries. As church, it's kind of like tidings. Starts off as tidings and ends up as a national newspaper, if you will. The news for the people. So all of this is what leads to democracy, and part of what happens is as the Christians in, say, China or India start doing these things, the non-Christians realize, oh my gosh, they are mobilizing common ordinary Chinese and Indians, and we Hindus or we Buddhists, we need to fight back. And so they would start, educating their people and forming newspapers and so forth, which is where you get kind of modern sort of political. And so the non-Christians would copy what the local Christians were doing. And this is all what Bob Woodbury is pointing out in his thesis. And the result, long term, here's a few recent articles as NGOs and people are into reforms are thinking today. How do you help nations in poverty? A lot of people saying the key is educate girls. Adolescent girls, the key to ending poverty. Why girls' education can help eradicate poverty. United Nations Chronicle, The Guardian. And missionaries have been doing this for 200 years. In many places around the world, because we go back to the Puritans, we've been educating girls in America since 1620 and 1630. And over the long term, it has this effect. And part of what happens, right, is if you're educating ordinary people, but of course, if you're educating ordinary people, the boys will be educated. You do need to educate them. But it's possible to just educate the boys and ignore the girls. But if you ignore the girls, but if you educate the girls, you've got both of them, don't you? You've got the girls and the boys. And that leads to all kinds of things on down the road. And so today, a lot of secular NGOs are picking up on this and saying, wow, this is significant. So some things that have been going on that we just haven't been aware of or recognized. I want to close with one big historical picture. This is my last, and we're going on, Michael will be going on with other sort of historical things, but this is my last shot. This is how I think of history. Ultimately, this is how I think of history. I'll just say it that, because in my mind as a Christian, ultimately history is about God and the kingdom of God. And it's related to missions in this, that oftentimes Christians have said, I'm joining a mission or I'm forming a mission or so forth. Theologically, all mission starts with God, right? In essence, and I think about this historically, if you can think of like a big, long timeline, I think of it like a river. It starts off as a little stream where God says, we have a world that needs to be redeemed. It's a fallen world. How am I going to do this? And he calls one man in his household, Abraham. And you have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This is the beginning of God's mission to the world. It's a strange plan, but this is God. And somehow it all fits together. And this is the beginning of this stream, and it grows, and it goes through to Joseph going off to Egypt, and then the children of Israel coming back to the promised land. And then we get through the time of the judges, and we get to the time of King David and Solomon, and then the Babylonian captivity, and we come back, and then you get to the time of Christ. And then you have Christ and the disciples, and then it breaks out of its Jewish community and starts reaching the Gentiles. And the Bible ends, but history goes on. And so what we've been seeing over the past few months is this history where this river is getting bigger and bigger, and it extends to the early church and the early church fathers with the Council of Nicaea and so forth. And ordinary Christians in Rome and Gentiles eventually spreads into Northern Europe to Patrick and Jerome and other sort of places, and grows further and further. And we get to the Reformation, and there's all kinds of people that we know of along the way, St. Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas and so forth, and a lot of women nuns and other people we don't know. And then it grows and you expand with the Reformation, and you get Martin Luther and John Calvin and so forth, and you get all these people, Jonathan Edwards and great Christians along the way from there. And then it begins to expand even further out into, it starts spilling out over into Africa and into China, and you can go into the 19th century and the 20th century, and all kinds of people who have been used by God in all sorts of denominations, Catholic and Orthodox and Protestant and Presbyterian and Baptist and Pentecostals, and now they're in Africa and they're in China, and this river is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're doing things not just in the church, but it's contributing to hospitals and education and dealing with justice. And we're down here at this end of the river somewhere, both individually but also as a church, right? Christ Presbyterian. And we're part of this big river, and the point is, we are called to be a part of this mission. And we're connected to all these people. We're all children of Abraham. They're all our brothers and sisters, and God has called us to a particular role. Individually, it might be different. Churches, it might be different. But we're a part of that much bigger stream of God's mission in the world. And so we ask ourselves, okay, what is it that God is calling me to here? And, with the remaining years I have in my life, what is it that God asks me to do? How do I fit into that big process of the kingdom of God? That's how I view history, and why it's one reason why it's helpful to get a context for these sorts of things. So there's that. I'll end with that and open it up to questions or comments from anybody.
So I have a comment.
Okay.
I have friends, actually generational friends from my parents now, me and my children, friends from India, in the Kerala province, which has the highest concentration of Christians. And one of my friends, they have a mission there, native, and she said that Thomas, one of the disciples, is historically known to have gone to India. And she said the great shame on the Indian Christians is that they kept the faith to themselves. And she continues to grieve that they could have had such an impact on the country for all these thousands of years, but that the church remained comfortable within themselves. And so they work very hard to counter that effort. And that was very eye-opening to me, to think about that for us, as you were saying, what is it that we are being called to, and the historical danger if we stay insulated. So just wanted
That's a very good point, and I think, especially for us in the West, where everything is geared towards our comfort, materially, but also even let's just make life as easy and as possible. I think it's a good reminder for us. For me, that's why it's really, really helpful for me to go to Africa every couple of years with my Malone students and get reacquainted again with, there's this wider world where things, where things are quite different, and that we are called to, and I ask myself. What is my role? I can partner with Isaac and Esther in different ways. What does that look like? And so that's what compels me to do that. Well, that's a good point.
First, Jay, thank you so much for these last several weeks. It has been so great to learn as many things as we all have. I wanted to say, as we were coming in, you were talking about David Livingston. So many different characters and figures throughout history, and they feel so far away from us so often. But David Livingston, as you go into the sanctuary today, he is in the healing window in the very back of the sanctuary.
Aha. So
look for him, but also the next two figures, Adaniram Judson and Crowther, are the reason, if you look in the bigger scheme of things, are one of the reasons we're sitting in your class today and not someone else's. Because the last church I served in Cleveland had a lot of Karen refugees who count Crowther as their Christian forefather. And when I was looking at how do I help this congregation and in Lakewood, how do I know more about Karen culture in Burma, I found your book. This was about 7 years ago, and I said, oh my goodness, this guy lives down in Canton, wherever that is. But I think it's not that far away. So we invited Jay to come up and speak about Adaniram Judson, Crowther, and that was about 7 years ago. And so Jay, by the Spirit, of course, but, through hundreds of years of history, Jay is here today because of that connection made, because we looked back and said, wow, isn't God great? All that God has done over there does still have a great effect here. So I wanted to lift up that connection, and thank you for such a wonderful class.
Well, thank you very much, yes. It's great to be here, like I said. So, perhaps we should just close with a word of prayer then. That'd be good. Heavenly Father, as we look at history, are reminded that it's actually so much bigger than we can comprehend, and yet we then can pick out ways that you have been at work in realizing there's a lot that we still do not know, and a lot that we probably will not know or comprehend, at least in this lifetime. But we do pray that you would help us to take what it is that we have learned and apply it in our lives in ways, say, okay, what is my role? What are you calling me to now? We thank you for your many, many gifts to us of other people, and we thank you for the many people who've gone before us, that on whose shoulders we stand, and on the different ways that we are who we are as Christians and as church because of the work of people who've gone before us. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.